With the grace and permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are once again together having a discussion with Brother Leslie Terbesi, otherwise known as Abdul Karim, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I'm coming to you from Kentucky, in the United States of America, and we're discussing elements of revisionism in Islam and elements of the histories of Islam that have been distorted, elements of the revelation which have been distorted in translation, and elements of the tradition which has been, how shall I say, misrepresented at very many levels and carried on for hundreds of years with not always the best of knowledge and wisdom, but with the best of intentions on the part of those who follow. But as you know, when you get stopped by a policeman on the highway, and you say, "Oh, I didn't know, us officer. I didn't know that was a law." The police officer is still going to hold you responsible, you see, for the law. And of course, it depends a little bit on how dangerous you had to put other people and yourself at risk. Now, if you're following certain traditions and doctrines in ignorance, and you're putting others at risk, your intentions might be good, but the outcomes, the results of your actions and your beliefs, how shall we say that? We say beliefs, because many people believe many things without actually having any primary knowledge of the things that they say they believe. So, and we can say that, oh, okay, well, yeah, all religion suffers from that to a certain degree. And the atheists say, oh, well, you have no proof that God exists. And of course, Muslims counter that by saying, well, creation is proof enough. And if you follow the scientific discourse into the present age, you'll agree that scientists are slowly and persistently, and even many of the physicists, against their will and, how shall we say, better judgment, but it's a personal judgment, are coming to the conclusion that, yeah, there is more than sufficient evidence for a source creator, as instructor Benjamin Bilal has named Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I like that term, source creator. It's not ambiguous in the least. So we're not discussing that sort of belief system, but we are discussing beliefs in certain traditions attributed to the prophet, attributed to the companions, attributed to rituals and necessary items of the religion, which may not be all that necessary as well. Um, what is necessary, to my knowledge, is the belief, the faith, and the faithfulness in willful actions that bring about the production of good fruit. And as the prophet Isa said, the son of Miriam, who's called Jesus Christ by many, and that's erroneously, because his name was never Jesus or the Christ, he said, you will know them by their fruits. You will know them by their fruits. And that was an answer to the question, well, how do we know the true believers? I'm sure the Arabists have all sorts of terms for people who believe in God, but believing is not sufficient, because the New Testament also says faith without works is dead. Now, if you're going to be following dead traditions, that means you're not producing fruit, you see. And if you're not producing fruits, there's a problem, and many people are frustrated because Islam has been kept away from uh, relevance in this area um, by these vain traditions. And what do I mean by that? Okay, well, we're producing fruit. You say, oh, look at all these beautiful mosques that we built. Well, that's wonderful, but do the people really need these beautiful mosques? Or do they need fruitful activity that's going to help them to sustain their life and sustain their relationship with each other, you see, and to sustain their autonomy? And Islam, as a political institution, no matter where you find it in the earth, now has lost its autonomy. And if it's maintained its autonomy, it has maintained that at the cost of moral and ethical righteousness, so that justice is not being served. And without justice, you can't possibly have what we refer to as al-Islam. So, Brother Karim and I are involved in the discussion of how this has come to be, how it is that Muslims have, for 1,000 years or more, dedicated themselves to a system which avoids justice at all costs and surreptitiously and mistakenly accords justice to an institution which practices injustice in terms of misogyny, in terms of male chauvinism, in terms of political chauvinism, in terms of uh, tribalism, which is forbidden. You see, how is this al Islam? It cannot possibly be. So we are involved in a discussion that, an ongoing discussion, inshallah, that sheds light on how this has come to pass. And our um, habit has been for me to give these introductions and then ask Brother Karim, who is well versed in the history and in the doctrinal positions, whether good or bad, you see, of those who claim al Islam. And so I have some questions for you today, dear brother, and inshallah, uh, we'll seek an answer through whatever it is and that not Allah has placed in your knowledge bank and in your heart. Um, with respect to the history thus far, we've covered certain things that have gone through the initial institutions of Islam during the first 200 to 300 years. We approached the Ottomans, but that's still a bit premature in this discussion so far. We've discussed how it is that the early Muslims had um, rejected rationalism. They rejected the ability of men to discern for themselves and to think for themselves and said, oh no, the leader said, no, you can't do that. We're the interpreters, we're the intermediaries, we are the priesthood, you see, if you will. And that has come down to us now as an institution, which many call the ulama. Um, and this has positive attributes, but many of these attributes are, I say, anti-Islamic. You see, because we don't need an intermediary. What we need is someone who really knows what they're doing, who's really studied the issue and said, well, this is what it appears to say. You see, in terms of translation, this is what the allegory appears to mean in terms of an ongoing knowledge of previous scriptures, because the Quran says itself it came to complete what came before and to explain it and to correct what came before. So if you don't know what came before, how can you know what the Quran is correcting or completing? You see, and many of this area of knowledge is being ignored. And I pursue this with Brother Karim and a few other people that I have the great privilege to have an ongoing discussion with. Um, and we seem to come into agreement that Muslim scholars have have inclined towards a bias which prevents the ulama, prevents the ulama coming up, the new ulama, the people who are entering the madrasas, the people who are coming up as the so-called scholars, and prevents the pedestrian Muslim from attaining knowledge, real knowledge, you see. And this is a form of repression of fitra, because without knowledge you remain ignorant, and if you are ignorant you cannot do your best, and if you cannot do your best you cannot serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and maintain the dominion that requires the practice of justice. If you're ignorant of what justice is, how can you enforce it? You see? And if you are ignorant of the ways and means of your enemy who has infiltrated your system, and we have established that that is the case here and in other places, which I conduct such investigations, we know that Islam was infiltrated. We know. This is fact, but it is not discussed. So the ulama is avoiding the discussion of these subjects. It's avoiding the discussion of mistranslations. It's avoiding the discussion of false histories. It's avoiding the discussion of the overwhelming amount and majority of false, manufactured, fabricated hadith. You see, this is a major, major problem. And if it's not discussed, if you don't recognize the problem, if you don't admit you have a problem, you cannot correct it. And you will continue to do what idiots do. Keep on doing the same thing, expecting a better result. It doesn't happen. All that happens is you build another masjid or build another madrasa to continue the facade, to continue the denial of truth. This is not Islam. This is not Islam. And so, with having said that, Brother Karim, I will give you maybe perhaps a pointed question here. How is it, in your estimation, and from what it is that you have studied, how is it that Islam has attained its knowledge and practice of the rituals which they claim to be genuine and authentic? Would you care to address that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, in fact, I have myself been struggling with this question because I noticed that there's a very strong emphasis on ritual in Islam as we know it today. But I don't see such great emphasis on ritual in the Quran. For example, Bukhari contains 98 hadiths on just where to put your hands when you pray. But there's not a single book in Bukhari on justice, as you just mentioned. But the Quran puts a very strong emphasis on justice. Surah 4, verse 135, Surah 5, verse number 8, and so on. I hear a bit of an echo. Do you hear it, Brother Omar? Or
no? No, I do not.
Oh, okay. I hope that's not going to be,
I think the recording is okay. It's probably just at your
All
end.
right. Yeah, okay. So, yes, definitely there has been a massive shift of emphasis, I think, from the ethical teachings of the Quran to a ritual. Likewise, we do not find any books in Bukhari about ethics. We don't find any book in Bukhari about rationality. And we do not find any book in Bukhari on freedom. So to me, these are massive, massive omissions. And so one begins to wonder what happened. How did this happen and what is the significance of it? The theory, so to speak, that I'm inclining to now is that my own analysis tells me that the original revealed Islam was reinvented in two forms afterwards by the ulama, so to speak. One is the traditional form, which puts a lot of emphasis on ritual and is intended to keep the peace at home, to keep people sedated and resigned to their fate, so to speak, because the doctrine of predestination is a very major component of traditional Islam. It has been endorsed even by luminaries such as Al-Ghazali and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So that Islam, that variant of Islam, or mutation, if you want to use a stronger word, was to serve domestic purposes, to keep the peace at home. The other mutation of Islam, what I call political Islam, was invented to serve the purpose of justifying war abroad, or the aggressive jihad, as we have spoken about it earlier. So the traditional Islam keeps the peace at home. The militant Islam keeps the war going abroad. You can see how different these two Islams are.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, both of them deny certain very basic teachings of the Quran. For instance, the Quran does not at all endorse the doctrine of abrogation. And certainly the Quran does not endorse the aggressive jihad or jihad al-talab, or spreading Islam by the sword, which is actually a direct violation of the prohibition of compulsion in religion in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 256. So these two variants of Islam basically served political purposes, and here I'm basically going along with the analysis that was articulated by Muhammad Shahrur in chapter 6 of his book, which I highly recommend. The book is called Quran, Morality and Critical Reason, and also it is all this point of view is basically endorsed by Dr. Omar Ramahi. He is in Canada, he's a professor at one of the Canadian universities, and his book is called, just published recently, it's called Muslims' Greatest Challenge, Choosing Between Islam and Tradition. So I think our knowledge of Islam was distorted by ulama who worked closely in collaboration with the authorities of kind of Islam, protect the elites. For instance, at the domestic level, if you say that everything has been predetermined by Allah, so any crime committed by any caliph will be you can blame it on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rather than on the people who committed it. Similarly, to wage aggressive jihad abroad. And once again, this was to provide the religious justification for what were basically raids, as it were, as Muhammad Shahrur puts it, and to give a religious sort of justification for these excursions, to expand the empire, to make new conquests, and to present it as jihad fi sabilillah, or basically spreading Islam by the sword. So politics basically corrupted our knowledge of the teaching of the Quran in two different ways. One, we have the so-called traditional Islam, and then we have the political Islam. But even the so-called traditional scholars, people like al-Mawardi, there's Imam al-Shafi, Imam al-Ghazali, and Ibn Khaldun, all endorsed aggressive jihad or spreading Islam by the sword, which came as a big shock to me, actually, personally, because I thought of these traditional scholars as basically quite knowledgeable about what the Quran says, but they have basically endorsed the doctrine that completely flies in the face of the teaching of the Quran, that basically turns this teaching of peace we find in the Quran into an ideology of war. Now, I just don't see how you could corrupt the message of the Quran more than that, but please help me if I missed anything. Thank you.
Well, I'm not that informed as to the doctrinal positions. I just look at things from the normal historical political perspective, and from the psychological perspective of humans, you see, who have not redeemed their lower nature. And I know that imperialism is a form of gang warfare. That's what it is. And if you're going to expound and expand your doctrines and your borders, respectively, with the sword. This is what Christians have done. This is what the Catholic Church has done. So it's a Catholic action. And Catholic means universal. And piracy is indeed universal. Plunder is universal. Organized political systems for plunder are universal. There's very, very few systems of political governance that do not organize themselves for imperial plunder. Japan was one of those countries who really didn't expand its border in imperialistic fashion until they were influenced by the Jesuit Reformation of Japan, beginning in the middle 19th century with the Western influences and their military influence and influx of modern warfare. And then it was forced into the position by Washington D.C., who cut it off from oil supplies, and then that sort of thing. But there are nations that did not expand their borders. China was amongst them. China never expanded its border. It demanded a fiefdom from Southeast Asia, but it never commanded in such a way as to remove the local authority and the local autonomy from Southeast Asian nations. But Muslims have done this. The Arabs have done this. And they continue to do this in one way or another. And you can look at modern pan-Arabism as another form of this extension of the imperial influence within the Arabs nations, one Arab nation against the other. I mean, they're all vying with each other for what they want to maybe consider to be the caliphate, and very few of them have done this in a peaceful manner, in a manner which is perhaps in accord with the Medina Constitution, which maybe you might want to address in your response to my comments here. So when I look at this history, I call it the cons keeping up with the cons. You see, it's just like the American suburban households. They see their neighbor has a new car, a new swimming pool, and they want one too. And so if they don't have the wherewithal to get it, they by hook or crook, they go and they take it. You see, not unlike the American gangster who's standing in the middle of the street hijacking a car. And the police ask him, "Well, why are you doing this?" And he said, "Well, we don't have it. You have it. We're going to take it." It's kind of like that. So I see that the Arabs ran out of their wherewithal, their sustenance, and they got used to a higher standard of living after they began collecting taxes. And of course, there's not much tax in the desert waste of Arabia. So they expanded their borders and began to collect monies elsewhere so that they could sustain a higher standard of living. That's what I see. And they used religion as an excuse for this. And they perverted what it is that Muhammad left to us as the Medina Constitution and as al-Islam. So what you say is in keeping with what I've observed, just as an ordinary reader of history, maybe a bit more informed than some others, but nevertheless, I gathered this information over coffee in the morning, you see, while reading texts that relate to history. And I read the text that people, or I did read the text in the past of written by people who are not mentioned in the madrasa, not mentioned in the university systems, which are educating our ulama. And then I noticed one other thing. The ulama never work. You see, they go to school, they learn at the knees of their parents and their grandparents, then they go to school, they go to madrasa. Then some of them who are more fortunate, they go on to college and university, and then they go right to the masjid without ever, breaking a sweat over tilling the land or, working a real job. So they're removed from reality as far as I'm concerned. And I noticed this everywhere I went, with very few exceptions of the ulama who have actually gone out into the world, became military generals or captains or of the military or of industry or of the small business, and then returned in their retirement years to the study of the theology, and then entered into the ranks of what you might call a theological or theologian, who then expresses what he or she perceives to be the truth of religion, but based on personal experience. So these people are students. You see, they've never worked. They never in their life. They've never driven a bus. They've never dug a ditch. Nothing. I saw one of them, a big fat-bellied fellow, try to break a sweat and follow Imran Hussein's uh, recommendation to establish an Islamic village. And after 20 minutes of trying to dig a ditch, he had to sit down and give it up. He was absolutely incapable. So these are people who are, if you remove them from their positions of authority, usurped authority, I might say, and I say that from an informed position, um, they they have nothing to offer. They have nothing to offer society. They can't do anything. They can't produce anything. Their good works are ineffective. Okay, and you say, well, where do you come from to say that, Dr. Omar? Well, I'm a doctor. Okay, I've been out there. I've been on the front lines in emergency rooms. I've seen the blood. I've had my hands in a man's belly and chest, in a woman's abdomen when she's given birth. I delivered 125 babies. I can produce more than theological opinions, you see. And so you've got an ummah that has remained ignorant at the hands of these people who have nothing else to offer other than their learning at the hands of people who have been teaching the same things like a broken record over and over and over again for 1,200 years. So um, that's my observation in response to what you've just said. And I think the two will corroborate, you see, a certain summary of the reality, you see. So, um, with that having been said, I invite you to continue your half of the narrative here and see if we can progress to further corroboration of what it is that has gone wrong. And let's try to add what it is that can possibly be added now to correct the situation, to correct the circumstances that many Muslims find themselves in because their religion is no longer relevant other than some sort of customary cultural safety net, you see, to which they run to when all else fails, and all else is failing, you see. And the ulama and the ummah are supposed to prevent this failure. That's why they were given Islam, al-Islam. That's why Muhammad uh, bequeathed to us the Quran and the doctrines and his example of having established it in Medina, you see, and then having to reinforce the walls of uh, Islam by enforcing justice when the Medina Constitution was not upheld by those who signed it, you see. So um, he didn't, in other words, what I see here, I see is a certain amount of injustice. For example, one of the caliphs declared war on one of the tribes who failed to pay tax. Well, is that in the Quran? You see, is that what Islam is supposed to do? Is that what Islamic leaders are supposed to do? Yeah. I don't think so. I don't think so. You know, we have this element of free will, and if you want to accept Islam, well, that's fine. If you want to accept some of its practices, that's also fine. That's between you and your creator. It's not between you and me. You see, the Constitution of Medina was one of cooperation for defense of the unit that they called Medina, and it actually changed the name of the place. I understand for that purpose because you have in there the word deen, and the word deen has everything to do with what is to be decided upon by the elders in the community to complete through acts of conscious will, you see, so that we enforce the defense of the unit that we have created. It was kind of a federation, a loose federation. This was the first example of al-Islam, but there was no dictatorial power there. There was the only time the Prophet, to my knowledge, intervened was when he was betrayed. Was when there was treachery. You see, you can't trust your back to someone who says they're going to defend you and then stick a knife in it. No, this has to be addressed. This has to be countered, and that's what he had to do, and he did it very, very wisely. But he didn't enforce himself or any of his practices in Islam upon anyone in Medina, to my knowledge. You know, people came of their own free will, and they cooperated with him of their own free will. There was no tyrannical, you have to pray this way or you have to pray at such and such a time. None of that. I don't see any of that in anything that I was able to read of the history, the uncorrupted history, which is very hard to come by. And none of that is in the Quran. I don't see it in the Quran. The Quran tells you no uncertain terms, that there's no force in religion. Well, there's no force in religion, and how can I force you to do something I consider to be religious? You see, that's untenable. It's irrational. But this is the way that tyranny operates. And we see that now in China, for example. It's the same phenomena. What they're doing in China with these lockdowns and all this COVID nonsense, it's just tyranny. There's no reason for it. There's no medical rationale for any of it. And yet they are enforcing this thing on their people. It's the same kind of tyranny in the religious system. And then to expand this, to go beyond the borders, you see, into other nations and begin to enforce it there, as the Arabs most definitely did. This is Islam by the sword. This is enforcement by the sword. It's not acknowledged in the Quran. If I persuade you to become a Muslim because you like the things I do and you like the things I say, you like the fruit that I'm producing by my example and by the activities that I produce and by the way I think, and you become a Muslim like me, well, that's good. That doesn't give me any rights over you or your household or whatever it is that Allah has provided for you. There's no right there. So I don't have the right to come into your household and say, hey, you're not praying 5 times a day, so we got to do something about this, Or I don't have the right to for you to send your child to me at my madrasa and then beat him because he's not pronouncing the Arabic in the correct way. Rap him on the knuckles or rap his behind. No, I don't have the right to do that. What gives me the right to do that? The only thing that gives me the right to do that is my own selfish thinking. You see, the Quran doesn't give me that right. Not that I see. So that's my response, and I know it's a little maybe emotionally involved, but nevertheless, that's my response. And I probably could go on and on. But I'm sure that you could add to that in a much more intelligent manner. based on your knowledge of the history and your knowledge of the doctrinal errors that have been enforced, you see, and the rituals that have been enforced in an unjust manner. So, with that having been said, dear brother, I hand the floor back to you.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, would like to point out that at Al-Azhar University, they still teach their students that people who don't pray, who don't attend Friday prayer, for example, have to be killed. They also teach that people who don't pay zakat also have to be killed.
Oh my
Now,
God.
to me,
Is that the
to
contemporary
teach
ruling?
that, no, that is contemporary reality at Al-Azhar University.
Oh my God.
And I find it very shocking because both of those beliefs contradict the Quran. They are based on problematic traditions. And how do I put it? It makes it is very misleading. I personally consider anyone who kills a person for apostasy, to me, that actually amounts to a crime and should
Yes.
be treated as such according to the law.
Yes.
Same for killing people for, say, blasphemy or adultery. These killings I also consider to be murders, and they have to be treated accordingly. It's just that Sharia has become so corrupted with the when the Hadith overruled the clear rulings of Allah in the Quran. This was a form of a lapse into shirk of some sort, where the words of human beings, the transmitters, were permitted to overrule and in fact abrogate and replace the rules of Allah. That is very, very catastrophic failure of Islamic jurisprudence. And the fact that it has survived so many centuries until today is absolutely shocking. The only way I can explain it to myself and whoever cares to listen is that only if you shut down your mind will you accept such beliefs, because no person is right-minded who has read the Quran would ever accept these beliefs that you have to kill people for blasphemy, apostasy, and adultery, for not paying zakat even, and for not praying the Friday prayer. This is a complete breakdown of reason and rationality. And by the way, Abu Bakr, when he went to war against what he called the apostates, he actually did not follow the sunnah of the Prophet, because the Prophet himself never killed anyone for apostasy. So he, in fact, departed from both the sunnah of the Prophet and the Quran, because the Quran does not prescribe any death penalty for apostasy, and it does not identify failure to pay zakat as a crime, a punishable crime. So unfortunately, what we have seen in Islamic intellectual history is a very serious corruption of the methodology of arriving at the rulings of the Sharia, and all this to be revised, rebuilt from bottom up, and based on assumptions that are in line with the teaching of the Quran rather than assumptions that go directly against it. And I think I have mentioned a few assumptions in our earlier talks. The way the Mufassirun describe the Quran is directly opposite of how the Quran presents itself. Because the Quran says that this is a clear book, Haza Kitabul Mubin. But the Ummah, the Mufassirun, developed a very complex science of tafsir that assumes exactly the contrary. There are unclear verses or words in the Quran. That's one. Another assumption that conventional tafsir makes is that the Quran is incomplete. Now, they have the audacity to make this allegation in the face of clear verses in the Quran, which say that the Quran is complete, comprehensive, and that Allah Ta'ala explains everything in detail. A third example of how these ulama contradict the Quran, they are basically asking us to disbelieve in these statements in the Quran, which describe it as a book that is clear and book that is complete. And by the way, whenever somebody doubts or stops believing in a single verse of the Quran, they are very quick to jump and say, oh, you have left Islam because you have disbelieved in one verse of the Quran. Well, what are they doing? They are asking us, the entire ummah, to stop believing in the verses that teach that the Quran is clear and that it is complete. And the third example I can give is the Quran presents itself as a coherent book in which we are not going to be able to find inconsistencies or contradictions. But what did the ulama say? Well, they say exactly the opposite. They say that there are many contradictions in the Quran. Some of them say there are only as few as 5. I'm talking about the cases of abrogation, because they overcome this alleged contradictoriness of the verses of the Quran by applying what they call the doctrine of abrogation, which is another complete invention and goes completely against the teaching of the Quran. But some of the ulama claim that there are as many as 500 verses that are contradicted by other verses in the Quran. Now, to me, this is very catastrophic. And in fact, as I argue in some of my work, it was the doctrine of abrogation that enabled them to cancel the peace verses in the Quran, all 120 of them, and replace them with the verse of the sword, or the 2 verses of the sword, Surah Tawbah verse 5 and Surah Tawbah verse 9. So it was through the doctrine of abrogation that the militant ulama basically transformed Islam as a religion of peace into Islam as an ideology of war. So you can see what the damage that they have done is extensive, and I could go on further, but maybe I shouldn't take up too much time, about how they basically tarnished the reputation and credibility of the Quran by alleging all these imperfections in it, flaws. The Quran presents itself to us as a flawless document, perfect, but they claim no, it is not perfect. And they even claim that they can produce something similar to the Quran, because the Quran says, if you don't believe that this book is from Allah, produce at least 10 surahs or at least one like it. Well, guess what? These people took up the challenge and produced not just 10 surahs, they produced 100 books, brother, 100 books of hadith. Because if you include the books produced by the Sunnis, there are 60 of them, not just the main 6 ones, there are others as well, plus the 40 Shias, you get a total of 100 additional books of supplementary and explanatory revelation. I'm shocked. You mentioned the problem of the fabrication of tradition. I agree, that is a huge problem. But there's an even bigger problem here, and that is the fabrication of revelation, because these hadith books are presented to us as revelation, brother, as wahi, you see, based on a verse, misrepresentation of the verse in the Quran, where Allah says that He does not speak of His own desire, it is by the revelation revealed, and some other misinterpretations of other verses. That was another major error of the Mufassirun, when they began to treat the words of human being as revelation, and in fact equal to the Quran, and in some ways even superior to it. Because the Mufassirun claim basically that not only are these wahi or revelation, and they based this on a tradition according to which the Prophet allegedly said, I was given 2 things, the Quran and something equal to it, in brackets the hadith. Now, this is just astonishing. So this laid the foundation for legislation based on hearsay, basically. Hearsay that would not be acceptable as evidence in an ordinary court of law. They made this hearsay into a foundation of Islamic law, which even overrules the rulings of Allah in Quran in those 3 cases I mentioned, for example, blasphemy, apostasy, and adultery. Now, what audacity these people have, or are they doing it out of ignorance? I'm really puzzled, brother.
I don't think so.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think so. I don't think it's out of ignorance. Generations that followed, they will follow then out of ignorance because of taqlid, because they're no longer thinkers. But the people who injected these concepts into the traditions and then into the doctrinal positions that Muslims have followed ever since, this is in keeping with the Talmud, because there are books in the Talmud whereby the Jews themselves say, hey, you know, God gets confused sometimes and He calls on us for advice. No, I'm not joking. I'm not joking at all. So this is the same thing you've just described. So in answer to your query and quandary, you see, there's your answer. It's right there. So there are people who genuinely believe that there were men walking the earth upon whom God depended for an opinion. You see, um, when he was confused, or maybe he forgot something. You see, um, I'm not expanding on this. I'm not exaggerating. This is a Talmudic position. You know? Now, most Jews who attend the pews, like good Catholics do on Sunday morning, they don't know these things. They don't attend to these things. They just are genuinely trying to worship God as best as they know how, even in their ignorant positions. But their leaders know these things. Those who study the Talmud, those who study Kabbalah, they know these things. So what you describe here is an imposition on Islam of this same position. Well, we know better, okay? And we are capable because we're so highly intelligent and such advanced human beings that we can help God with his revelation and we can actually correct it, you see. Now, how this became a tenable position in Islamic doctrine evades me. See, not that it came into Islam, but how it remained and became tenable. That's what that what causes me to have a quandary, because the wonderful people who followed, in the wake of this particular type of imposition, these are great minds. And I'm not aware, of course, I haven't studied all of these books, and I'm sure there are books that have not been translated that remain to be studied. I'm not aware of anyone objecting to the position in a formidable way that would have substantially changed the tradition. The traditions have been accepted. And we have modern day scholars um, who have become very popular, and they're holding hands with the chaplains out of the Vatican and out of the Buddhist Empire and elsewhere, with holding hands on the stage with Hindu shamans and all this sort of thing, and professing the perennialist position, and they're kind of saying, hey, um, you know, um, we have this, and we know I've heard them say, we know that there are a great substantial amount of traditions which have been fabricated, and but nevertheless, this is the direction which we're taking the umma. You see, based on, and they still maintain the traditional position, and they don't correct the position. You see, they're not taking the steps to correct the position, and that's what disturbs me. You say, okay, I heard Hamza Yusuf say, okay, well, there's only about 500 reliable hadith. Okay, sir, will you please give me the book with those 500 that are really reliable, and let the people know that the other 100,000 or so are just, to be ignored. Which one of these are the 500? Where's that book? We don't have it. And you have to ask the question, why don't we have it? And then I listened to somebody like Yusuf Estes, who gives a wonderful history of Freemasonry, but he ignores the Jewish influence. He ignores the influence of the Kabbalah. He ignores the imposition of the Vatican in this realm. He just ignores it, as if Freemasons are just some sort of fellowship of good old boys who just got together to get along and took the wrong idea and took a wrong turn someplace without Jewish or Vatican influence and direction, you see. And I know from having studied the history that this same sort of Jewish and Vatican influence entered and corrupted Islam. I know that. It's a fact, you see. And how they entered and how they did it and how it remained without this corruption, this is what disturbs me. And when I did bring it up at the council tables amongst the ulama, no one once wanted to discuss it. Everyone wanted to withdraw to their positions of safety. And it's a political decision. It's not a theological position. It's not a philosophical position. It's not a religious position at all. It's a political decision, one to remain under the safety net of the powers that be. Well, the powers that be, you see, are the same powers that established the system of idolatry that our beloved prophet brought down. It's the same system. There's no difference. Isa identified it amongst the Jews. The prophet Ezekiel identified it amongst the Jews. Bani Israel, even then, before the Bani Israel became Jews, okay, before the Babylonian captivity, after which it only got worse, and before the Catholic Church became Catholic. It's the same system of idolatry. It was there in the Kaaba. It was there in Medina. And he brought it to an end. And then they bring all this stuff back in, you see, slowly and surely. And then our scholars don't correct it. They don't take the effort to correct it. And the people, the students who are genuinely seeking the truth, have to rely on people like yourself and myself to bring this to the table over the internet here so that it can be at least discussed or at least be made known. This is outrageous. It's outrageous that the ulama should boldly go forth as if this problem doesn't exist, as if the corruption did not enter Islam, as if there's no correction to be made. You see, this disturbs me, dear brother. This disturbs me, and I'm sure it disturbs you as well.
Oh, very, very much so. Now, you mentioned you were asking why nobody comes along, or so few people come along and question these beliefs. Well, the mafia has a code of conduct. It's called the code of silence.
Yes.
So why are the ulama silent about this, and others as well? Well, because the ulama declared that anyone who, as it were, breaks the code of silence or basically disagrees with their opinion has left the fold of Islam, and you know what that means according to their teaching.
Yes.
Such a person who left the fold of Islam because he disagreed with the ulama has to be killed. So they're basically threatening any dissenting opinions with death. How different is that from the way the mafia operates? That's what I would like to know. I think some of these people, by calling this death penalty for apostasy and making it part of the Sharia, they have turned this ummah into a mafia, if I may put it that way. And Muhammad Shahru refers to it when he says the threat of being killed for apostasy hangs over the Muslims. Any Muslim who wants to express a different opinion, he refers to it as, this threat, he refers to it as, I quote, intellectual terrorism. And I think that's what it is. Yes. So it is through force that traditionalists have been able to maintain this false or fake, if you like, interpretation of the teaching of revelation, and unless it is challenged from both inside and outside, I don't see the prospects of any change coming anytime soon. However, I do see signs things are changing, partly because of the presence of the internet, and also in the Arab world, people are awakening, and more people are turning to the Quran-centric perspective in Islam, which is basically believes that the real sunnah of the Prophet was to follow the Quran, and therefore anyone who follows, who does not follow the Quran and follows, say, Bukhari and a company, is following something the Prophet never followed and never even heard about. So when the Quran-centric people are accused of being, rejecting the Sunnah, actually, I don't think so. It is the people who follow Bukhari and company. They are the ones who are the real Sunnah rejectors, because they reject the Sunnah of the Prophet, which was to follow the Quran. You might say that the people who follow the Quran only, or in matters of deen, they are actually the real Sunnis, because they follow what the Prophet himself followed, you see. So this is the problem that we have. People have been so brainwashed that they can hardly contemplate that having two sources of Islam somehow could be problematic. To me, the whole belief that there are two sources of Islam is not very different from saying that there are two gods. How can you have two sources of Islam, of Deen, in a religion which teaches monotheism? Who is that second source? You see, so they have elevated not just the Prophet, peace be on him, but even the transmitters to the rank of lawgivers. Brother, this is really, really catastrophic. So where do we even begin to rectify these aberrations in both Islamic jurisprudence and exegesis? We have to begin somewhere. Could be in a clubhouse, could be here, could be publishing stuff and what have you. So, yeah, perhaps I can just end my point there. Yes. Unless you want me to comment about the Charter of Medina very briefly. In fact, I'm publishing a book tomorrow, inshallah, called on this, where I talk about this issue. The book is called Islam and Pluralism, because I wrote this text in response to the perception widespread among Muslims, traditional Muslims, that somehow pluralism is hardly different from polytheism. There's a huge difference. Pluralism, I know, it's incredible. The moment they hear the word pluralism, they think polytheism. That is very shallow thinking. You need to differentiate the two. Just because the country is practicing pluralism the way the Prophet practiced it in Medina, that was reflected in the Medina constitution, it doesn't mean that the person who tolerates a plurality of ethnic groups under one umbrella, that does not make this person a polytheist. A polytheist is one who believes in more than one God. A person who believes in pluralism is the one who recognizes the verse in our Qur'an, I think Surah Al-Hujurat, where Allah Ta'ala says, we have made you into tribes and nations so you may not know one another, not that you may despise one another. So here we have a basic confusion between polytheism and pluralism. You can have a perfectly plural society which retains its Islamic character in a sense that it is governed by a constitution that reflects Islamic principles, yet it allows people who are non-Muslims to coexist peacefully without putting them at risk or trying to force them to become Muslim, either by asking them to pay protection money, like the mafia does, or submitting by this jihad al-talab, or this practice of aggressive jihad. So there's a lot of work ahead of us. We need to reinterpret, re-examine with a critical eye the traditional and political manifestations of Islam, and we need to go back to the drawing boards, start from square one, and rebuild the whole system of our knowledge, which has been unfortunately very, very deeply corrupted. Thank you.
Yes, I agree with you. Let's pick this theme up: the Medina Constitution and pluralism versus perennialism, or any other kind of ism, including Islamism. Let's pick that up next week, and let's discuss the Medina Constitution in terms of what it is that you are now expressing in your new book with respect to pluralism and the political position that should be taken amongst those and by those who adhere to al-Islam, inshallah. So, with that having been said, brother, I want to thank you once again for another wonderful discourse. I think we had a little bit of difficulty with the transmission here, but I still believe we can understand most of what it is that you had to say. And inshallah, we'll have a better connection next week. So,
inshallah,
I invite you to continue to do what it is that God has determined for you to do, as I will do so here. And I enjoy this part of my life. It's the best part of my life, actually. And with that having been said, all praise belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.